This podcast was created as a supplemental learning resource for this course. The content is based on assigned course materials, including open educational resources, textbook chapters, instructor-developed explanations, examples, and applications connected to course topics. AI tools were used to help transform course material into a conversational podcast format, including the use of AI-generated narration. The AI narration is intended to make the material more engaging, accessible, and flexible for students. However, the podcast should not replace careful reading of assigned materials, reviewing course lectures, or completing course activities. Any interpretations, examples, or explanations included in the podcast are provided for educational purposes and are the responsibility of the instructor. Students should rely on the assigned readings, course lectures, and official course materials as the primary sources for exams, assignments, and class discussions.
So usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this distinct expectation of structural precision, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's very cut and dry.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the X-ray shows this jagged white line right across the bone. The doctor points to the screen, and the reality is just undeniable.
Right. It's visually absolute, broken or not broken.
Yeah. But the moment you pivot from studying the skeletal system to studying the human mind, that whole metaphorical X-ray machine just shatters.
It really does. Because humans, we gravitate toward binary clarity. We're deeply comforted by things we can isolate and perfectly categorize.
We want the universe to operate like simple clockwork.
We do. But with psychology, you're no longer looking at calcium and bone density. You're trying to map a staggeringly complex, constantly shifting landscape of, well, thoughts, emotions, memories.
Right, and the craziest part is that the subject we are observing, the human brain, is the exact same apparatus we're using to do the observing.
Which makes it inherently murky. It's the ultimate diagnostic ambiguity, really. The variables are entirely invisible to the naked eye.
I mean, you can't exactly put a physical ruler next to human grief, or weigh a unit of peer pressure on a digital scale.
Exactly. And that inherent invisibility is precisely why relying on our default, everyday ways of perceiving the world is, well, it's dangerously insufficient when we try to understand psychological realities.
So we basically need a specialized lens to see through that ambiguity. And building that lens is our fundamental objective for this deep dive today.
Which I'm very excited about.
Me too. We are diving into Chapter 1 of your open educational resource textbook, Research Methods in Psychology. So for all you undergraduate psychology students listening, welcome.
Welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here.
We really are. And we're acting as your study companions today. Rather than just, giving you a superficial tour of the terminology, we're going to tear down the architecture of how you form your everyday beliefs.
We are going to examine why your intuition is a remarkably flawed narrator, actually.
Yeah, and then build the rigorous framework that defines a scientific endeavor and finally apply that to the life or death realities of clinical therapy.
Because the overarching mission here is a total transformation in how you process information.
Right. By the time we trace the trajectory from the basic features of science to the goals of research, and finally to empirically supported treatments, we want you to stop functioning as a passive consumer of psychological claims.
You're going to start evaluating those claims through the highly critical, highly systematic lens of a researcher.
But hey, quick disclaimer before we get into the weeds. This audio companion is meant to enhance your understanding. It is not a replacement for actually reading the chapter and doing the exercises.
Definitely read the textbook. It's crucial.
For sure. So to achieve this transformation, we first have to confront a rather uncomfortable philosophical question that the textbook throws at us right away.
Oh, this is the big one.
Yeah. Before we can even touch the concept of psychological science, we have to look in the mirror and ask, how do we actually know the things we think we know?
Right. As we navigate our daily lives, we make thousands of decisions based on this massive internal database of knowledge. Where did it all come from?
Well, the textbook categorizes how we acquire this daily knowledge into 5 primary methods. The first one, and probably the most pervasive, is the method of authority.
We accept information as true simply because it was presented to us by a source we deem credible or powerful.
Yeah, and the text points to this universally relatable example. Making your bed in the morning.
Oh, yeah?
Like when you're a child, you don't run a cost-benefit analysis on the utility of smooth sheets.
No, you definitely don't.
You do it because a parent, the ultimate localized authority figure, told you to do it. You acquire the knowledge that beds must be made purely through their decree.
And this reliance on authority, It extends way beyond childhood chores. We structure our entire reality around it.
We really do?
Think about it. We believe that tectonic plates cause earthquakes, or that specific vitamins prevent scurvy. Not because we've personally conducted the geological surveys.
Or run biochemical assays in our kitchen, right?
Exactly. Yeah. We believe it because textbook authors, professors, and medical professionals transmitted that information to us.
So it basically functions as a necessary cognitive shortcut. I mean, the human brain consumes a massive amount of energy.
Huge amounts.
And from an evolutionary standpoint, it would be highly inefficient to independently verify every single piece of data you encounter.
You'd never get anything done.
Right. If you had to personally recreate all of human scientific discovery from scratch before deciding what's safe to eat, you'd never survive.
Cognitive offloading to authorities allows society to function. It's vital.
And there's a big but here, it introduces a massive vulnerability into our knowledge base, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Because authorities are fundamentally human. They are susceptible to the exact same cognitive biases, hidden agendas, and outright errors as anyone else.
Yeah, if an entire society outsources its truth-seeking to a single governing body without requiring verifiable evidence, well, history shows us the catastrophic results of that.
Surrendering your critical thinking apparatus is dangerous.
So, if blindly trusting authority is a trap, the logical alternative seems to be trusting ourselves, right? Trusting what we can physically verify.
Which leads us into the second method of knowing, empiricism.
Right. At its core, empiricism is acquiring knowledge through direct observation and sensory experience. And the classic philosophical illustration here is the problem of the white swans.
The swan analogy beautifully isolates the limitation of localized observation.
Walk us through that one.
Sure. So imagine you spend your entire life in an English village. Every single day, you walk past the local pond and you observe swans.
Okay, picturing it.
Through direct, personal, empirical observation, you note that every single swan is white. Your brain, operating efficiently, synthesizes this data into a universal rule. All swans are white.
And it feels like an irrefutable fact because you have literally witnessed it with your own eyes, repeatedly, over decades.
Exactly. But the moment you board a ship, travel to Western Australia, and observe a black swan gliding across a river, your supposedly universal fact disintegrates instantly.
Wow. Yeah, that illustrates the fundamental blind spot of casual empiricism. Our sensory experiences are tightly bounded by our geographical location, our specific cultural environment, and frankly, our highly limited lifespan.
Casual empiricism tricks the brain into mistaking a very small, biased sample size for the totality of reality. We see few instances and immediately extrapolate to the entire universe.
I see this constantly in everyday social dynamics, you know? Someone might conclude that all people are inherently untrustworthy simply because they happen to experience 2 bad breakups in a row.
That's a perfect example.
They're using their narrow empirical data, their personal heartbreak, to construct a flawed universal model of human psychology. It is empiricism, but it's heavily distorted.
And the distortion goes even deeper than sample size. Our sensory organs themselves are heavily filtered.
What do you mean?
Well, we experience optical and auditory illusions all the time. Our memories aren't static recordings. They are dynamic, reconstructive processes highly prone to corruption.
So when we rely solely on casual empiricism, we are essentially gathering data with broken instruments.
Exactly. Broken instruments.
Which brings us to the third method, which feels the most elusive, honestly. Intuition.
Ah, intuition.
The textbook describes it as acquiring knowledge without relying on conscious reasoning or direct, deliberate observation. The example is instantly relatable. You're talking to a close friend, and even though they're saying all the right words, you just know they are lying to you.
You haven't hooked them up to a biometric monitor. You haven't logically mapped out the inconsistencies on a whiteboard.
No, the knowledge just arrives seemingly fully formed in your gut. It feels almost magical.
Or at least highly mysterious. But there is an actual biological mechanism underneath that gut feeling.
Right. The text references Malcolm Gladwell's concept of thin slicing from his book Blink.
Yes. The mechanism behind intuition is essentially rapid subconscious pattern recognition. Over the course of your friendship, your brain has built a massive baseline model of your friend's standard behavior.
Like their microexpressions, their vocal cadence, their posture.
Precisely. And when they lie, they deviate slightly from that baseline. Your conscious mind is way too slow to catch a microsecond eye twitch, but your subconscious processing speeds are remarkably fast.
So it registers the anomaly and sends an alert to your conscious mind in the form of a physical sensation, of a gut feeling.
Right, so intuition is incredibly powerful in environments where we possess a deep well of prior experience.
Like a seasoned chess grandmaster intuitively knowing a board position is weak.
Or an experienced ER nurse intuitively knowing a patient is crashing before the monitors even go off. In high-stakes, time-compressed situations, that rapid cognition saves lives.
But transferring that survival mechanism to the realm of scientific discovery is catastrophic, isn't it?
It is. The fatal flaw of intuition is that it's utterly saturated with our pre-existing prejudices and cognitive biases.
You might intuitively feel a stranger is dangerous simply because they belong to a different demographic group.
And that intuition feels viscerally true to the person experiencing it. But it's actually just an activation of deeply ingrained societal conditioning, not a reflection of objective reality.
Intuition is private, subjective, and immune to external verification.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have authority, which can be corrupted. We have casual empiricism, which is too narrow. We have intuition, which is biased. This leaves us with the fourth everyday method, rationalism.
Rationalism involves using logic and reason to arrive at a conclusion.
So if we know that all mammals are warm-blooded, and we know a dog is a mammal, we can rationally deduce that a dog is warm-blooded.
Right. Rationalism provides a rigorous structural framework for thought. It ensures our arguments are internally consistent.
But there's a catch here too, right?
A huge catch. Logical validity does not guarantee empirical truth. You can construct a perfectly logical syllogism based on false premises.
Give me an example.
Well, if I state all birds can read, and a penguin is a bird, logic dictates that penguins can read.
The logic is flawless, but the conclusion is completely absurd.
Exactly, because the initial premise was not grounded in reality.
Right.
Rationalism requires accurate data to process, or it just elegantly processes nonsense.
Elegantly processing nonsense. I love that. Which finally pulls us toward the solution. The fifth method of knowing. The scientific method.
The ultimate corrective tool for all the flaws we just dissected.
Wait, looking at the definitions, the scientific method is heavily reliant on observing the natural world. If empiricism is also about observing the natural world, how are they actually different? Why isn't science just a fancy synonym for empiricism?
It's a great question. The divergence lies entirely in the methodology of the observation. The textbook introduces a critical qualifier here. Science relies on systematic empiricism, whereas our everyday observation is casual empiricism.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that systematization. Casual empiricism is passive. You happen to be at the pond, you happen to see white swans, you aren't controlling the environment.
Right. Systematic empiricism is highly intentional. It is aggressively structured to eliminate the very biases we just outlined.
So to systematically observe swans, you don't just stand at your local pond.
No, you engineer a study. You sample swan populations across different continents at different times of the year. You track their genetics. You establish blind observation protocols, so your expectation of seeing a white swan doesn't influence your data collection.
Wow. So systematization is the mechanism by which we force our limited, localized human perception to capture a wider, more objective reality.
It takes the basic human instinct to observe the world and wraps it in a protective layer of rigorous logical structure.
It intentionally controls for the blind spots of personal experience. It demands verifiable evidence to override authority, and it completely removes subjective intuition from the final analysis.
We can view our everyday methods of knowing, intuition, authority, casual empiricism as our brain's default operating system.
Optimized for speed and immediate survival.
Yes. The scientific method is a difficult, unnatural software update that we have developed. It is incredibly slow, highly resource-intensive, and often frustrating. But it is the only mechanism we possess that systematically filters out our cognitive illusions and moves us closer to objective truth.
I want to pause here for a second. For everyone listening, let's do a small thought experiment. Think about a piece of information you acquired in the last 24 hours. A headline you read, a fact a friend told you, whatever.
Run that piece of knowledge through this filter. Did you accept it based on the authority of the speaker? Did you assume it was true because it matched a casual observation you made recently? Or did it just intuitively feel correct because it aligned with your pre-existing worldview?
Recognizing the origin of our knowledge is the first step in dismantling our own ignorance.
It forces metacognition. You begin to observe your own observation process. And that is the foundational mindset of any effective psychological researcher.
Absolutely. Okay, so having established that our everyday methods are deeply flawed and that systematic empiricism is the solution, the text shifts focus to the scientific method itself. But this brings up a massive point of contention.
Oh, the old physics versus psychology debate.
Yes. Psychology students constantly encounter this friction, often from peers in the hard sciences. They ask, with a hint of skepticism, is psychology actually a real science?
That skepticism stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what defines a scientific discipline.
The general public equates science with its superficial aesthetics, right? Beakers of bubbling liquid, laser arrays, massive particle colliders.
Because psychology deals with seemingly intangible constructs like memory retrieval, depressive episodes, or cognitive dissonance, it's frequently miscategorized as a soft discipline, akin to philosophy.
But the textbook dismantles that stereotype with this excellent, slightly absurd analogy. It asks you to visualize a highly trained biologist, someone who undeniably qualifies as a scientist. If you were to airlift that biologist and drop them into the control room of a massive radio telescope observatory and ask them to map the trajectory of a distant pulsar, they would be utterly useless.
Completely useless. And conversely, if you took an astrophysicist, handed them a tranquilizer dart gun and a GPS tracking collar, and told them to conduct a longitudinal field study on the mating behaviors of Canadian moose.
They would fail completely.
Spectacularly.
The tools they utilize are fundamentally different. The subject matter is completely unrelated, yet the academic community universally classifies both the astrophysicist and the biologist as scientists. Why?
Because the defining characteristic of a science is completely divorced from its subject matter or its physical instrumentation. What unifies all branches of science is the underlying conceptual approach to investigating the natural world.
So psychology earns its classification as a science because it applies that exact same rigorous conceptual approach to its specific domain, the observation of human behavior and mental processes.
Exactly. So we really need to dissect that conceptual approach. The text outlines 3 fundamental features that must be present for an endeavor to be classified as a science.
We've already explored the first feature in depth, systematic empiricism, moving from anecdotal observation to highly structured data collection.
Right. Moving from noting that people seem crankier when it's hot outside to designing a longitudinal study correlating decades of meteorological data with highly specific municipal crime statistics.
While actively controlling for confounding variables like economic fluctuation and population density. Okay, what's the second feature?
The second feature is that science must restrict itself to empirical questions.
And an empirical question is defined by its testability.
Yes, it is a query about the actual state of the natural world that can be resolved by systematically observing that world.
Which draws a hard boundary around the territory science is allowed to explore. Not every profound question is an empirical question. The text gives the example of asking, are women more talkative than men?
We can debate the social implications of that question, but fundamentally it is empirical. We can design an audio recording protocol, sample a diverse population, count the words spoken per day, and analyze the data set. We can observe the answer.
Conversely, questions of ultimate morality, aesthetics, or pure philosophy fall outside this boundary.
Right. Asking, is it morally justifiable to steal food to prevent a family member from starving? That is a deeply important human question. However, it is not an empirical one.
You cannot resolve a moral dilemma by running a participant through an fMRI scanner. Science can illuminate the psychological trauma of starvation, but it cannot empirically calculate objective moral correctness.
It prevents science from overstepping into the realm of philosophy. And this concept ties directly into an incredibly important textbook exercise regarding the structure of scientific claims.
Yes, let's examine a specific claim to see if it qualifies. The claim is people choose spouses who are similar to their parents, or they choose spouses who are completely different from their parents.
This is a textbook trap.
It totally sounds like an observation about human behavior on the surface.
It does. But scientifically, it is an entirely useless statement because it violates the principle of falsifiability, a concept heavily championed by the philosopher of science, Karl Popper.
The mechanics of falsifiability are fascinating. A theory is only scientifically valid if there is a conceivable empirical observation that could prove the theory wrong. It must stick its neck out.
Right. It has to risk being refuted. Let's apply falsifiability to the spouse claim. If a researcher conducts a study and finds that participant A married a partner who shares the exact personality traits of their father.
The researcher says, aha, the data supports the claim. People choose spouses similar to their parents.
But if they analyze participant B and participant B married someone who is the psychological polar opposite of their mother?
The researcher looks at that completely contradictory data and says, aha. The data still supports the claim because the claim stated they choose spouses similar or are completely different.
Exactly. Because the claim encompasses every possible human outcome, no amount of observation could ever falsify it.
A theory that explains every outcome actually explains absolutely nothing.
It makes no predictive bets about how the world works. If I drop a pen, the theory of gravity makes a highly specific, highly falsifiable prediction. The pen will fall toward the center of the Earth. If the pen floats upward, gravity is falsified.
Psychological theories must be equally vulnerable to being proven wrong. Unfalsifiable theories are often constructed specifically to protect the ego of the theorist from ever having to admit an error.
It's a defensive mechanism masquerading as science.
Which leads us to the third indispensable feature of science, public knowledge. This principle dictates that a scientific discovery does not truly exist until it is submitted to the wider community.
You cannot conduct a brilliant experiment in total isolation, write the results in a private journal, and call it science.
No, science is inherently a social and collaborative mechanism. The textbook places heavy emphasis on the rigorous process of peer review and the necessity of open access publication.
But we must understand the mechanical why behind this social requirement. It serves two vital functions. First, it is the engine of self-correction.
Because scientists are still humans relying on a massive cognitive apparatus that is prone to error.
Precisely. A single researcher, no matter how brilliant, is susceptible to confirmation bias, methodological oversights, or simple statistical miscalculations.
So by publishing the methodology and the raw data, the researcher invites the global scientific community to actively try and dismantle their findings.
Other scientists will attempt to replicate the exact experiment. If they cannot replicate the results, the original finding is called into question. Peer review and replication act as a brutal, necessary filtration system that slowly purges errors.
And the exercises in the book include a link to a PhD comics video detailing the open access movement. It highlights that if research is locked behind expensive paywalls, this crucial self-correcting filtration system just grinds to a halt.
And the second function of public knowledge is cumulative growth. Science builds upon itself.
Like Isaac Newton's famous assertion that he saw further by standing on the shoulders of giants.
Exactly. Every published peer-reviewed study acts as a single brick. A researcher reads a study, identifies a gap in the findings, formulates a new empirical question, conducts a new study, and adds another brick.
This cumulative process is impossible if knowledge is hoarded privately.
Very true.
So listeners, consider the distinction between an empirical and a non-empirical question in your own life. Pause and think. Formulating a hypothesis that can actually be tested is much harder than it appears. What is a psychological phenomenon you are curious about?
Now, can you construct a falsifiable claim about it? Can you imagine a specific piece of data that would force you to admit your hypothesis was completely wrong?
If you can't imagine what would prove you wrong, you aren't thinking scientifically yet.
You are likely just protecting a deeply held belief.
Which transitions us perfectly into understanding what happens when people mimic the aesthetics of science while ignoring those three fundamental features. We use the strict definitions of systematic empiricism, empirical questions, and public knowledge as a defense mechanism against pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience is a fascinating cultural phenomenon. It encompasses beliefs, practices, and claims that aggressively present themselves as scientific.
Often utilizing complex jargon, establishing institutes, and donning the visual markers of authority.
But they critically lack the methodological rigor required to actually be science.
The textbook refers students to the Skeptic's Dictionary, which catalogs various pseudoscientific movements. Let's analyze a few of these to understand exactly where their scientific architecture collapses. First up is cryptozoology.
The search for hidden or mythical creatures. Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, the Chupacabra.
Now, biology discovers new species of insects or deep-sea fish all the time. Why is searching for a new species of frog considered rigorous biology while searching for Bigfoot is categorized as pseudoscience?
The demarcation line lies in falsifiability and systematic empiricism. When a marine biologist searches for a new species, they operate from established ecological models. They utilize highly systematic sampling techniques.
And most importantly, their search parameters are falsifiable.
Right. If they thoroughly sample a specific trench and find nothing, they accept the data and update their models. Cryptozoology, conversely, relies heavily on anecdotal casual empiricism, blurry photographs, and unverified eyewitness accounts.
And when a massive systematic search of the Pacific Northwest yields absolutely no physical evidence of a giant primate, the cryptozoologist does not say the theory is falsified.
They alter the parameters of the claim to protect the belief. They argue that Bigfoot possesses supernatural hiding abilities, or that the creature is interdimensional and phased out of reality during the search.
They render the claim completely unfalsifiable, effectively removing it from the realm of science.
Exactly.
Another massive example provided is homeopathy. This isn't just a fringe internet theory, it's a global industry generating billions of dollars. Homeopathy operates on the premise of like cures like. The idea that a substance causing symptoms in a healthy person will cure those symptoms in a sick person if it is heavily diluted.
The mechanism of this extreme dilution is where the scientific validity entirely disintegrates. Homeopathic remedies are routinely diluted to the point where, based on the fundamental laws of chemistry, there is a statistical probability of 0 that even a single molecule of the original active ingredient remains.
You are essentially consuming pure water or a pure sugar pill.
Right.
But if the chemical mechanism for physiological change is entirely absent, how do we explain people who swear they feel better after taking it?
We explain it through the placebo effect, which is a very real, very powerful psychological mechanism. The mere belief that one is receiving medical intervention triggers the brain to release endorphins, temporarily altering the subjective perception of pain or nausea.
The issue is not that people feel better. The issue is that the homeopathic industry claims the underlying mechanism is the diluted substance, not the psychological placebo.
And why is it categorized firmly as pseudoscience? Because it wholly rejects the self-correcting nature of public knowledge. Over decades, rigorous, double-blind randomized clinical trials have repeatedly demonstrated that homeopathic remedies perform exactly equivalently to placebos.
Mainstream science updates its understanding based on that data. The homeopathic community ignores the systematic empirical data, refuses to alter its claims, and continues to assert scientific validity without scientific evidence.
It's a classic hallmark of pseudoscience.
The text also briefly mentions pyramidology, the belief that ancient pyramids possess mystical healing energies or were constructed by extraterrestrials.
Again, this fails the falsifiability test.
Yeah.
How do you empirically test a claim about alien intervention occurring 4,000 years ago when no physical evidence is presented? You can't.
Archaeologists, conversely, use systematic empiricism, analyzing wear patterns on ancient copper chisels, mapping worker grave sites, to build a falsifiable, evidence-based understanding of human engineering.
While cryptozoology and pyramidology might seem like harmless eccentricities, the textbook highlights a fourth category where pseudoscience becomes actively destructive, especially for students entering the mental health field.
Yes, pseudoscientific psychotherapies. When the veneer of science is used to validate unproven psychological treatments, vulnerable people are placed in immense danger.
The book specifically names past life regression, bioscreen therapy, and rebirthing therapy.
Let's examine the mechanics of rebirthing therapy to understand why it is so hazardous. It sounds wild.
It is. Rebirthing therapy operates on the completely unfalsifiable assumption that many adult psychological pathologies, like depression or attachment disorders, are the direct result of the physical trauma of being born.
And the proposed treatment involves forcing the client to physically simulate the birth process to release this supposed repressed trauma, which often involves wrapping the individual tightly in blankets, having multiple adults press their body weight onto them to simulate contractions, and forcing them to struggle their way out.
The physical reality of that is terrifying.
Yeah.
And the mechanism of action is entirely based on a practitioner's intuition rather than biological reality.
Tragically, this lack of scientific grounding is not just theoretical. This specific therapy has resulted in multiple documented fatalities, including the horrific suffocation deaths of children whose adoptive parents were instructed by practitioners to utilize this method for behavioral modification.
It is a devastating failure of the system. The therapy is founded on an unfalsifiable premise. It completely bypasses systematic empiricism, and when tragic outcomes occur, proponents often refuse to subject their methods to rigorous, peer-reviewed clinical trials.
It mimics the language of clinical psychology while abandoning all of its protective scientific safeguards, which underscores why the textbook directs students to resources like Neurobonkers, which specializes in debunking flawed psychological claims.
Understanding the rigid criteria of the scientific method is not an abstract academic exercise. It is the primary ethical shield a clinician possesses to protect their patients from well-intentioned but fundamentally lethal pseudoscience.
Having cleared the intellectual underbrush of pseudoscience, we can now look at the actual architecture of legitimate psychological science. What is the day-to-day objective?
The textbook outlines 3 primary sequential goals of scientific research: to describe, to predict, and to explain. It also divides the research itself into 2 major categories: basic research and applied research.
The progression of those 3 goals represents the maturation of scientific understanding concerning any specific phenomenon.
Let's build a highly relatable scenario to track this progression. Let's look at the relationship between caffeine consumption and university study habits.
Okay, imagine a researcher operating at the very first level. Goal number 1, describe.
At the descriptive level, the researcher's sole objective is accurate, systematic observation. They're not asking why or what happens next. They might station themselves in a university library over an entire semester, systematically recording data.
They document that 85% of students studying past midnight possess a caffeinated beverage. They record the volume consumed and the duration of the study session.
The resulting publication simply describes the current reality. It maps the territory. Once the territory is described, the researcher advances to goal number 2, predict.
Prediction leverages the descriptive data to anticipate future behavior. The researcher analyzes the data set and identifies strong correlations.
They formulate a hypothesis. If an undergraduate student consumes more than 400 milligrams of caffeine after 8:00 p.m., they are 70% more likely to remain in the library until 2:00 a.m. compared to a non-caffeinated control group.
They are finding the statistical connective tissue between variables. This is highly useful for universities planning library hours or student health interventions. However, prediction alone is fundamentally unsatisfying to the scientific mind.
You can predict that dropping an apple means it will hit the floor, without actually understanding the physics of gravity. Which brings us to the ultimate scientific objective. Goal number 3, explain.
To achieve explanation, the researcher must abandon the observational setting of the library and bring the phenomenon into the highly controlled environment of the laboratory to uncover the hidden causal mechanisms.
They're no longer just watching students drink coffee. They're placing those students into an fMRI scanner.
A functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner. This technology measures brain activity by detecting changes associated with blood flow.
The researcher utilizes the fMRI to peer beneath the behavioral surface. They observe that caffeine molecules cross the blood-brain barrier and perfectly fit into the brain's adenosine receptors.
Adenosine being the neurotransmitter that accumulates throughout the day, signaling fatigue.
Right. Caffeine blocks these receptors, preventing the brain from receiving the fatigue signal, while simultaneously triggering the release of adrenaline and dopamine, which artificially prolongs sustained attention and alters how memory is consolidated.
That is an explanation. We have moved from simply noticing a coffee cup on a desk to mapping the precise neurochemical cascade that keeps the student awake. Describe, predict, explain. It is a deeply satisfying intellectual progression.
And this progression is pursued through 2 different avenues of inquiry: basic research and applied research. Basic research is driven by pure, unadulterated curiosity. Its objective is to achieve a more detailed and accurate understanding of human behavior and cognitive processes simply for the sake of expanding human knowledge.
Like the researcher mapping the exact visual processing pathways that allow a human to distinguish between 2 slightly different shades of the color blue. They are not trying to cure a specific form of color blindness right in that moment. They're just trying to understand the fundamental mechanics of human vision.
Applied research, conversely, is highly pragmatic. It is conducted specifically to address and solve an immediate practical problem in the real world.
A researcher designing a specialized, high-contrast dashboard display for commercial airline pilots to minimize visual fatigue and reduce fatal pilot errors is conducting applied research.
The textbook is careful to point out that these are not isolated silos. There is a deep symbiotic relationship between the 2. The metaphor of basic research acting as the foundation of a house, while applied research acts as the walls and roof, is a bit static.
I actually prefer to think of it through a technological lens. Think of basic research as the equivalent of writing the underlying physics engine for a complex video game.
Oh, I like that.
The programmers who spend years coding the mathematical rules for digital gravity and collision detection aren't building a specific level or an enemy character. They are just defining how the digital universe operates. Applied research is the game designer who comes in later.
They build the specific racing level to solve the problem of entertaining the player. But the game designer cannot build a functioning car if the basic researchers haven't already coded the underlying laws of digital friction and momentum.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. You cannot design an effective, applied treatment for Alzheimer's disease if basic researchers have not already spent decades painstakingly mapping how memory is encoded, stored, and retrieved in a healthy hippocampus. The applied researcher solving the crisis of today is entirely dependent on the basic researcher who mapped the mechanisms yesterday.
Listeners, try to apply this division to an area of psychology that genuinely fascinates you. Pause and think. Formulate one basic research question, a question driven by the desire to uncover a fundamental mechanism.
Like, how does an adrenaline spike alter the speed of visual tracking?
And then formulate an applied research question designed to solve a problem. What specific pregame visualization protocol most effectively reduces performance anxiety in collegiate gymnasts? Differentiating between the desire to understand and the desire to solve is a key skill.
This leads us into perhaps the most transformative section of the chapter, where we confront the intense friction between scientific findings and our own deeply held assumptions. We're moving into the conflict between science and common sense, or what the text refers to as the trap of folk psychology.
This is where psychology students frequently experience a profound sense of dissonance. They open a massive textbook filled with complex studies and think, I have been interacting with humans my entire life. I intuitively understand motives, emotions, and social dynamics. Why do I need to memorize these laboratory findings when I already possess common sense?
That vast repository of intuitive beliefs we collectively hold about human behavior is folk psychology. It is our cultural common sense. And the most humbling lesson the scientific method provides is that our folk psychology is frequently, demonstrably, and spectacularly incorrect.
The textbook utilizes a series of exercises to systematically dismantle these intuitive myths, and the mechanics of why we believe them are fascinating. Let's analyze myth number 1. You cannot truly love another person unless you love yourself.
This concept is incredibly pervasive. It is foundational to popular self-help literature and ubiquitous on social media. It feels completely intuitively correct. If your internal emotional reservoir is empty, how can you possibly pour affection into someone else?
The logic feels sound, but what happens when it is subjected to systematic empiricism? When researchers actually measure relationship satisfaction, attachment styles, and clinical depression inventories, the empirical data shatters the bumper sticker.
Really? How so?
While severe low self-esteem can undoubtedly introduce friction and insecurity into a relationship, there is zero empirical evidence suggesting it biologically or psychologically incapacitates an individual's capacity to experience deep, genuine, and profound love for a partner or a child.
Wow.
Individuals suffering from clinical depression who often battle intense self-loathing frequently demonstrate immense empathetic love for their families. The scientific reality of human emotion is far more resilient and complex than our folk psychology assumes.
That's incredible. Let's look at myth number 2, which has profound implications for emergency response protocols. People who receive crisis counseling immediately after a traumatic event are better able to cope long-term.
This is a devastating example of well-intentioned folk psychology causing measurable harm. The intuitive logic is straightforward. A traumatic event causes a psychological wound. Common sense dictates that you should immediately treat a wound.
Therefore, we develop protocols where counselors are dispatched immediately following a school shooting or natural disaster to force victims to talk through and process the event. It seems like the height of empathy and psychological care.
But the science reveals a terrifying contrary reality. When systematic empiricism was finally applied to these immediate debriefing protocols, analyzing long-term outcomes for victims, the data revealed a shocking trend. In many instances, individuals subjected to immediate forced crisis debriefing actually exhibited a higher incidence of long-term post-traumatic stress disorder compared to those who were simply left alone to process at their own pace.
Unpacking the mechanism of trauma consolidation explains why, right? Immediately following a horrific event, the human brain utilizes profound defense mechanisms, like dissociation or compartmentalization, simply to survive the day. The brain is attempting to quarantine the terrifying sensory data.
Exactly. When a counselor forces the victim to vividly recount and articulate the details before their neurological system has stabilized, it essentially forces the brain to re-experience the trauma vividly, disrupting the natural quarantine process and deeply embedding the traumatic memory into the neural architecture. Science proved that our empathetic common sense was actively re-traumatizing people.
This perfectly illustrates why clinical intuition must submit to empirical data. Okay, the third myth from the text is one that personally upended my entire academic worldview.
The designated study spot.
Yes, the myth states studying is most effective when it is always done in the exact same location. Every single high school study skills seminar preaches this. Find a quiet desk, face a blank wall, eliminate all external variables, and study there exclusively to build an unbreakable academic habit.
The folk psychology logic here is based on the idea of minimizing distractions to maximize focus. However, cognitive psychologists investigating the underlying mechanics of memory retrieval discovered a phenomenon known as encoding variability.
How does encoding variability actually function in the brain? I was so surprised by this.
Well, when you study a list of vocabulary words, your brain does not just encode the words themselves. It simultaneously, subconsciously encodes the environmental context, the smell of the room, the hum of the air conditioner, the quality of the light. If you exclusively study at your isolated desk, that knowledge is tethered to one specific set of environmental cues.
And when you walk into a completely foreign environment, like a cavernous, echoing exam hall, those familiar environmental cues are missing, making the memory significantly harder for the brain to retrieve.
Exactly. Encoding variability demonstrates that if you study the same material in a variety of locations, a bustling coffee shop, a silent library, a park bench, your brain attaches the information to multiple diverse environmental cues. You are building multiple redundant neural pathways to the same piece of information.
The introduction of slight environmental instability actually forces the brain to create a stronger, more flexible memory that can be retrieved regardless of the testing environment. The science actively contradicts the common sense advice.
It begs the question, if the scientific data is readily available, why is our collective brain so stubbornly resistant to updating its beliefs? Why do we fiercely protect the folk psychology?
The textbook points students to a video featuring psychologist Scott Lilienfeld, who provides the mechanical explanation for our stubbornness. He details the concept of confirmation bias, the most pervasive cognitive flaw in the human operating system.
We briefly touched on cognitive bias earlier, but the evolutionary mechanism driving confirmation bias is what makes it so powerful. Confirmation bias is the brain's hardwired tendency to aggressively seek out, vividly remember, and assign disproportionate weight to information that validates our pre-existing beliefs.
While simultaneously ignoring, forgetting, or hyper-criticizing any data that contradicts those beliefs, if an individual holds the folk psychology belief that full moons cause erratic behavior, they will experience intense confirmation bias. If they work in an emergency room on a full moon and witness a chaotic influx of patients, their brain immediately tags that memory. See? The moon causes chaos.
They develop severe tunnel vision. The cognitive failure occurs because they completely fail to notice or record the dozens of other full moon nights where the emergency room was perfectly quiet. They also fail to register the chaotic nights that happen to occur on a random Tuesday. They do not engage in systematic data collection. They simply harvest the specific data points that protect their belief.
Why are we wired this way? From an evolutionary perspective, the brain is not designed as an objective, truth-seeking machine. It is designed to consume as little energy as possible while keeping the organism alive. Radically altering your worldview requires a massive expenditure of metabolic energy.
It is far more efficient and often more socially cohesive to simply maintain your current belief structure and filter out contradictory evidence. We are neurologically incentivized to be anti-scientific in our daily lives.
Because our default state is so flawed, the textbook emphasizes that learning research methods is not just about memorizing statistics. It requires cultivating two highly specific, actively maintained critical thinking attitudes. The first is skepticism.
Skepticism is often culturally misunderstood as cynicism, a refusal to believe anything. But scientific skepticism is entirely different. Scientific skepticism is a methodological pause.
When presented with a claim, regardless of how intuitively true it feels, the skeptic actively searches for the underlying evidence.
They ask specific mechanical questions. What is the source of this claim? What was the methodology used to generate the data? Are there alternative, equally plausible explanations for this outcome that the researcher ignored? Skepticism is the friction that prevents bad ideas from sliding into the accepted knowledge base.
The second attitude required is arguably the most psychologically difficult, a tolerance for uncertainty.
Humans are deeply intolerant of uncertainty. The brain constantly seeks closure, pattern, and definitive answers to relieve the anxiety of not knowing. If we experience a psychological ailment, we demand an immediate, unambiguous explanation and a rapid cure.
But the reality of systematic empiricism is that it is painstakingly slow, highly nuanced, and frequently yields complex partial answers. Tolerance for uncertainty is the intellectual discipline to look at an incredibly pressing question and say, the current data is inconclusive. I will withhold judgment until systematic evidence is available.
It is the ability to sit comfortably in the dark without forcing a false light. It is the ultimate defense against the simplistic, dangerous answers provided by pseudoscience.
This philosophical framework leads us directly to the final and most practical section of our deep dive. We have explored the mindset of the researcher. They demand systematic empiricism, they hunt for empirical questions, they are deeply skeptical, and they tolerate uncertainty. But how does this academic framework translate into the real world?
Many students reading this textbook have no desire to spend their careers in a research laboratory conducting statistical analysis. They intend to become therapists, counselors, and clinical practitioners. They want to work directly with human suffering. Why is a mastery of this rigorous scientific methodology non-negotiable for them?
To understand that, we must delineate the structural relationship between the two primary domains of the field. The textbook distinguishes between experimental psychologists and clinical psychologists.
Experimental psychologists are the architects of the knowledge base. They typically hold doctoral degrees, operate within university or research institute settings, and their primary function is to design and execute the systematic studies, both basic and applied, that we've been discussing.
They are the ones putting students in fMRI machines or running longitudinal studies on relationship dynamics. Clinical psychologists are the practitioners on the front lines. They utilize their expertise for the direct diagnosis and treatment of psychological distress and pathology.
They are the individual sitting across from a patient experiencing a severe depressive episode or debilitating anxiety. The friction arises when a student assumes that clinical practice is purely an exercise in human empathy, deep listening, and interpersonal connection.
While those skills are vital for establishing a therapeutic alliance, relying solely on empathy and intuition to dictate the actual treatment is clinically reckless. We already explored how the well-intentioned intuition behind immediate crisis debriefing inadvertently caused higher rates of PTSD, and how the intuition behind rebirthing therapy resulted in fatalities.
Empathy without empirical guidance is a blind engine. The scientific method is the steering wheel. This is why the textbook introduces the critical concept of empirically supported treatments, commonly referred to as ESTs.
An EST is a specific psychological intervention that has been subjected to the most rigorous levels of scientific scrutiny and has consistently demonstrated its efficacy. Unpacking the mechanics of how a treatment becomes an EST is crucial. It doesn't just happen because a prominent therapist writes a best-selling book about their new method.
It requires a specific mechanism. The randomized clinical trial, or RCT. The randomized clinical trial is the gold standard of applied systematic empiricism. Let's say a researcher develops a new form of therapy for treating specific phobias. In an RCT, they recruit a large pool of individuals suffering from that phobia.
Crucially, they randomly assign these participants into different groups. Randomization ensures that any underlying variables like age, severity of the phobia, or socioeconomic background are evenly distributed across the groups, preventing those hidden variables from skewing the results.
One group receives the new therapy. Another group might receive an established therapy or a placebo treatment, perhaps just sitting with a counselor who offers no active intervention, only sympathetic listening to control for the placebo effect of simply receiving attention.
After a designated period, the researchers systematically measure the reduction in phobic symptoms across all groups. If, and only if, the group receiving the new therapy demonstrates a statistically significant improvement compared to the control groups, and if that study can be replicated by independent researchers, the therapy earns the designation of an empirically supported treatment.
Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT for depression, or exposure therapy for anxiety disorders are prime examples of ESTs. They are the clinical equivalents of FDA-approved pharmaceuticals.
This establishes a profound ethical mandate for anyone entering the clinical field. You have a moral obligation to utilize tools that have actually been proven to function, rather than relying on tools you simply feel good about.
The textbook presents a brilliant scenario exercise at the end of the chapter to force students to grapple with this exact ethical dynamic. Let's analyze it from multiple angles. The scenario posits a situation where a practicing clinician argues that their specific brand of therapy is an art form.
They claim it relies entirely on their personal intuition, their unique empathetic connection, and years of subjective experience. Because it is an art, they argue, it is entirely immune to the rigid metrics of scientific evaluation.
It is the ultimate rejection of systematic empiricism. Let's evaluate this art form clinician from three distinct societal perspectives provided by the text. Perspective 1. Imagine you are a judge presiding over a complex criminal trial involving allegations of child abuse.
The prosecution calls this clinician to the stand as an expert witness. The clinician testifies, "I cannot provide empirical data or cite standardized assessments, but my profound clinical intuition tells me the child is telling the truth and the defendant is guilty."
From a judicial standpoint, allowing that testimony is a catastrophic failure of the legal system. The justice system, much like the scientific method, demands verifiable evidence to mitigate human bias. If the clinician's method of determining truth cannot be empirically validated, their testimony is nothing more than subjective opinion, highly susceptible to their own confirmation bias. You cannot incarcerate a human being based on a practitioner's unverified intuition.
Perspective 2 changes the financial reality. Imagine you are a claims adjuster for a major health insurance provider. This clinician submits a substantial invoice for a year of art form therapy provided to a patient. Do you authorize the payment?
Insurance providers operate strictly on risk and outcome data. They require actuarial proof that an intervention will successfully resolve the pathology, thereby reducing future medical costs. If the clinician openly admits their treatment lacks empirical validation, there is zero statistical guarantee of a positive outcome. The insurance company will rightfully reject the claim, prioritizing funding for empirically supported treatments that possess a proven track record of efficacy.
Perspective 3 is the most intimate and urgent. Imagine you are the prospective client. You are enduring crippling panic attacks that are systematically destroying your quality of life, your career, and your relationships. You arrive at this clinician's office in a state of desperation.
They inform you, "I intend to treat your severe neurological and psychological distress utilizing my personal art form. I possess no systematic empirical evidence that this method resolves panic disorders, but my intuition strongly suggests it might be beneficial."
An uninformed, desperate patient might submit to the authority of the clinician. But a patient armed with the critical thinking skills of this textbook will recognize the immense danger. If you required life-saving cardiac surgery, you would never consent to a surgeon who wanted to bypass established surgical protocols to try an intuitive art form on your heart.
The human brain is infinitely more complex than the heart. Accepting unverified, intuition-based mental health treatment is gambling with your cognitive survival.
That scenario brilliantly solidifies the core message of the chapter. Clinical intuition is undoubtedly necessary for building rapport, reading the subtle emotional shifts in a room, and tailoring communication to a specific patient. But the actual interventions deployed, the mechanics of the therapy itself, must be anchored deep within the bedrock of experimental research. Subjectivity in the diagnosis and treatment of pathology is a liability, not an asset.
As a practical application of this concept, consider the questions you would ask if you were seeking a therapist tomorrow. Pause and think. You are no longer required to blindly accept their authority. You can actively interrogate their methodology. You might ask, are the specific modalities you utilize considered empirically supported treatments by the broader psychological community?
Or, what systematic metrics do you use to track my symptom reduction over time to ensure the therapy is actually effective? Or, how frequently do you integrate newly published, peer-reviewed clinical research into your ongoing practice?
A clinician, grounded in the scientific method, will welcome those questions with immense respect. A clinician who becomes defensive or dismissive when asked for empirical validation is signaling a profound red flag. Valuing the rigorous self-correcting mechanisms of science is the highest form of respect a practitioner can offer their patient.
It guarantees they are offering a tested solution, not a subjective guess.
We have journeyed through an immense amount of conceptual territory today, dismantling old assumptions and constructing an entirely new analytical framework. Let's weave the central threads together to ensure the architecture holds.
We initiated the deep dive by examining the fragility of our everyday methods of knowing. We unpacked how our evolutionary reliance on authority, the geographical limitations of our casual empiricism, and the severe cognitive biases infecting our intuition render us fundamentally unreliable observers of the psychological world.
To correct that unreliability, we defined the strict parameters of psychology as a science. We established that scientific validity is not determined by the presence of a laboratory or specialized equipment, but by the relentless application of systematic empiricism, the restriction of inquiry to falsifiable empirical questions, and the absolute necessity of submitting findings to the self-correcting crucible of public knowledge and peer review.
We utilize those strict definitions to expose the mechanisms of pseudoscience, exploring how phenomena like homeopathy rely on the placebo effect while ignoring empirical data, and how the unfalsifiable nature of pseudoscientific therapies can lead to catastrophic physical and psychological harm.
We then mapped the sequential goals of legitimate research to systematically describe a phenomenon, to predict its occurrence, and ultimately to uncover the hidden causal mechanisms to explain it. We differentiated the pure curiosity driving basic research from the pragmatic problem-solving of applied research, recognizing that the fundamental physical laws mapped by the former are entirely necessary for the practical solutions built by the latter.
We then confronted the stubborn resilience of folk psychology, detailing how evolutionary energy-saving mechanisms like confirmation bias force us to protect intuitive myths, like the necessity of a single study location or the efficacy of immediate trauma debriefing, even when systematic empiricism proves them false.
And finally, we translated this entire academic architecture to the clinical setting, demonstrating logically, legally, and ethically why the practice of clinical psychology must be relentlessly tethered to experimental research through the mandatory use of empirically supported treatments.
It represents a fundamental rewiring of your intellectual approach. You are transitioning from a state of passive acceptance to a state of active, systematic inquiry. To finalize that transition, I want to leave you with a challenge centered on the concept of tolerance for uncertainty.
It is the hardest skill to master. We exist within a hyper-accelerated digital culture that demands immediate, absolute certainty. Algorithms reward instantaneous, highly polarized opinions. In an environment that aggressively incentivizes pretending to know everything immediately, possessing the intellectual discipline to pause, survey the complexity of a psychological issue, and clearly state, the systematic evidence is currently insufficient, I do not know yet, is an incredibly radical and subversive act.
It requires suppressing the ego's desire to be right in favor of the intellect's desire to be accurate.
Exactly. My challenge to you as you continue your coursework is to actively monitor your internal response to ambiguity. When you encounter a complex human behavior, resist the magnetic pull of your intuition. Resist the comfort of an immediate common-sense explanation. How can embracing the discomfort of uncertainty, sitting in the dark until the empirical data arrives, transform you not only into a sharper student of psychology, but ultimately into a more ethical, effective, and deeply responsible professional?
That is the core philosophy of the discipline. Consider that as you prepare for your next lecture. As we close this deep dive, we want to reiterate the crucial boundary of this audio companion. We have spent an hour dissecting the mechanics of these concepts, but this conversation is a supplement to, not a replacement for, the rigorous work of reading Chapter 1 in your Open Educational Resource textbook. The true neurological consolidation of this material happens when you engage directly with the text, struggle with the specific terminology, and apply these frameworks to the exercises provided. We have handed you the lens of systematic empiricism. Now you must choose to look through it.
The ambiguity of human behavior awaits your analysis. Good luck.
And whenever you feel absolutely certain about why someone acted the way they did based purely on your gut instinct, remember the X-ray machine of your common sense is fundamentally broken. Demand the data. Stay curious.